So good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. I will present some results from my PhD project focusing on the lake whitefish, and in which I'm interested in speciation genomics. So in that context, I combine RAD sequencing data and allele frequency spectrum to infer demographic history of the lake whitefish species. So when you're interested in the study of divergence, speciation with gene flow, there is a fundamental question: what shapes the genomic landscape of differentiation? So let's see this pretty complex scenario as example of given populations which will start to diverge, split into two populations, and during some period gene flow can occur and some demographic events will affect each population. So talking about demography, we know that temporal variation of the effective population size and migration events will affect the genomic composition of each population. So considering two chromosomes in the ancestral populations, when the divergence starts, that's not super clear here, but differentiation begins, even in the face of gene flow, and you can reach a certain amount of differentiation between the two populations. And when gene flow occurs again, during this expansion of the bottleneck, for example, you can have an erosion of the genomic differentiation. But we know that other processes can be evolved in this pretty complex genomic landscape of differentiation, such as selective pressures, which can induce differentiation locally around locally adapted alleles, represented by the stars here. And when gene flow occurs, some genomic region can be freely exchanged. We are talking about neutral genomic region. And when gene flow stops, the genomic island of differentiation, so here you have an increase of the size of the genomic region with an increased differentiation, and when the gene flow occurs again, you can have a little erosion of this region where the differentiation is higher due to locally adapted alleles. And when you combine these two processes, you can observe pretty complex patterns. So the idea behind that is that knowing that demography and selection will shape this genomic landscape of differentiation, we need to integrate basically temporal and chromosomal variation of the effective population size and migration. So to understand these patterns and basically to realize them in historical inferences. So now let me introduce the lake whitefish system. Mitochondrial-based studies identified different glacial lineages. And interestingly, in the south of Quebec, we have a contact zone between two glacial lineages. Let's take a zoom on this region. So we have 5 lakes: Témiscouata, East, Webster, Indian, and Cliff Lakes, harboring sympatric populations of lineatic dwarf whitefish and benthic normal whitefish. And what is interesting between these lakes is that we observe a phenotypic divergence continuum. So here you can see, for given phenotypic traits, an increase of differentiation between the dwarf in white and the normal in black on the distribution of this trait. What is interesting too is that this divergence continuum matches at the genetic level. So we have an increase of the differentiation given by an increase of the values of FST. That's what you can see with the tails here. And we have an increase of the genomic island of differentiation. So basically we have the differentiation value, FST values, on the y-axis, and the x-axis corresponds to the distance from the center of the genomic island of differentiation given by the 0. So this pattern could be due to different level of progression of primary divergence or different level of progression of secondary intergradations, which will erode this differentiation. That leads us to the question of what was the influence, is there an influence of the historical demographic on the parameters on the divergence continuum? So the first question was, we have to know if there were a shared history of divergence among species pairs, and we were interested to include the selective effects in our divergence models. So we use RADseq data. We genotyped more than 200 individuals, realized some entering step to define our markers, and we kept only oriented SNPs. So that means that we kept loci which were polymorphic in the lake whitefish and monomorphic in the European lake whitefish that we used here as a notebook. So we were able to define the derived states from the ancestral states for the given loci. And we realized the demographic inferences with Allele. So basically, the first step is to obtain the joint Allele frequency spectrum for each lake. So that's a bidimensional representation of your allelic frequencies for the dwarf population on the y-axis, the normal on the x-axis, and the spectrum was projected on 13 biallelic individuals. So we have 26 categories. And each cell corresponds to a category of the probability to get the derived allele, and the color corresponds to the frequency of that allele. Then we build demographic models, and after several optimization steps, we get some statistics to determine the best models. So, coming to the models that we tested, we built several models based on the 4 classical models of divergence. Briefly, the simple isolation with migrations, allowing migration during the divergence, ancient migration allowing gene flow only in the initial step of the divergence, and the secondary contacts where gene flow occurred after nanopatric phase. That was for homogeneous category of models. We implemented a heterogeneous category of models with by adding the differential gene flow. So basically, that corresponds to a category of loci which will with different effective migration due to their linkage with nearby locally adapted alleles. We implemented the selection allele insights models. Here the idea was to impute and to represent variation of the effective population size locally at the chromosome level, and population size in the time given by expansions or bottlenecks. So that's 26 models which were tested. And coming to the results, it was interesting to see that our spectrums based on the data show the same pattern of divergence. Here you can see in the corner of the frame an increase of less shared alleles between the sympatric populations. After getting using delta AIC values to determine the best models, we were interested to use the weighted AIC. So that's what we can see here with the heat map. Basically, we have a temporal information on the x-axis with the 4 homogeneous models, simple isolation, for example, and the gross model associated. And we have the different category of models, homogeneous, heterogeneous for the n parameter, etc., and the combination to finish. And so the best models, the model with the higher probability to be the model for a lake and to be the best scenario is given by the red color. So to be more precise and clearer maybe, so you can see here the spectrum from the data, the spectrum from the best models, and the scenario associated. So for the first lake, we observed a secondary contact with an heterogeneous migration during an expansion phase, contemporary expansion phase, after the less glaciation, so for the dwarf population, and a regression for the normal population. For the second lakes, we have surprisingly, we get the more complex model for the secondary contact scenario. So we have a variation, so footprints of selection allele insights on the chromosome level affect heterogeneous migration and expansion of the populations. The Webster Lake showed an ancient migration with heterogeneous migration. And for the most divergent lakes, again, we obtain most complex model for the secondary contact scenario. So that's interesting to observe post-glacial secondary contacts. But what was interesting, we have kind of the same story in all the lakes, but we get some different parameters estimation. For example, we have a decrease of the effective population size following the divergence of continuum. We observed asymmetrical gene flow mainly associated with asymmetrical effective population size. The dwarf population was bigger than the normal population, and we observed heterogeneous introgression based on the estimated parameters. So, because we were interested by the effects of the new implemented parameters, here we compare two categories of models. So, on the y-axis, you have the model score, basically corresponding to the standardized IRC values of the models. And in black, you have the category without the parameters, the new parameters implemented, and in gray with the parameters. So here, for example, we are talking about the population growth, and the tendency is that the models were better improved, the population growth parameters, improved the model's prediction. That was the same kind of pattern with the heterogeneous migrations, with some statistical values in some links. And interestingly, we get the same kind of results with the heterogeneous effective population size locally at the chromosome level, which improves the fits, but mostly for these two legs for the most divergent populations. So based on that, we improved our model estimation by using the new implemented parameters. So we really need to integrate this kind of information in demographic and so the demographic and selective effects in demographic inferences methods. It was pretty interesting to see that the whitefish species pairs retain the signal of secondary contact during the post-basal expansion phase. And the pretty complex pattern that we observed, so this famous, interesting heterogeneous landscape of species divergence has been shaped by variable introgression rates and linkage selections. So to wrap up everything, going back to these questions, if there were an influence of historical demographic effects on the divergence continuum, that's a pretty tricky question. And what I can say for now is that it should be a pretty complex interplay between selective pressures and demographic contingency in each case, because we have different patterns of effective population size variations, different gene flow, introgression rates, etc. So, based on that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I would like to thank my supervisor, Bernacchi and Pierre-Alexandre Gagna, the Bernacchi's lab, and some people that I met